Okay, so we'll take up where we left off. We, last time, with our app, created two classes, which were active record classes. We have our student class and our house class. They are related to each other with a belongs to and has many association. And we have a database that is being populated with test data, hundreds of records being generated by way of our seeds script. And that looks like this. We start off by destroying all the houses, so we just clear out the database to begin with. We have house set to dependent destroy on its relationship with students, meaning that when we destroy the houses, the related students will also be deleted. And then we create 8 houses using names supplied by Faker, unique ones. There are only 8 houses that Faker can generate, and that's why we had to limit this to 8. If you put it to a larger number, you'll get an exception. So that's where that comes from. Points, generate a random number for that. Number of students, another random number, had to be cast to an integer. And then for that random number of students, we create those students by way of the association. So we go to this house variable that we created up here, go to its students collection, and create a student by name, picking it just a random name. And then at the end, we print out some information about the houses and students. From the console now, we could look to see who some of those students are. And for any one of those students, we could ask for that student's house object, or even directly to the name of that student's house. And then for any given house, like this one is house 14, for example, so we could ask, how many students are in said house. Sorry. And we would see that for this one, there are 56 of them. And we could find the first or last of the students in that house. And you can see each one of them has their foreign key set to that house ID. Okay, so that's just a recap of what we did last time. But we're still only working, or have only worked, with active record up to this point. We haven't done anything with the web side of Rails. So if we look over here, we're still at a point where we're just loading up this test message. So we're going to need to create more now in our application. Usually paired with a model, or models in our case, is we need controllers and views. So the views are going to be the things that act like templates. They generate the HTML for us, and they're going to be very reminiscent of how we use PHP in templating mode to do looping inside of HTML, or decisions inside of HTML, or echoing inside of HTML. It's called, the view language is called ERB. There are other styles of view languages that you can plug into Rails. So when I work with Rails, I use something called Slim, which is a slight variant on ERB, but we'll be using ERB at this point. And then we also need a controller, because a view is only activated when a URL is sent to a Rails application, and then the Rails routing system will direct that to invoke a particular action within a controller. And a controller action is just a method in a class.
I cloned the repository.
Yeah.
I understand we have to install something, right?
If you clone the repository, the steps are that from that repository's folder, you have to first run bundle install to make sure you've synchronized the gems that the repo is asking for. And then you need to do a Rails DB migrate to run the 2 migrations to create the 2 database tables. And then you should be able to run Rails S and see the server up and running.
Just as a reminder, because I'm sure you mentioned this yesterday, the way that we are creating tables is not is it the same that is scaffolding?
Yes. So when you do a Rails generate scaffold, it will generate the same kind of migrations for you as when you do a Rails generate model. But the added benefit of scaffolding is that it also generates the routes and the views and the controller associated. And so we skip that step. We're going to make all of those manually. And so I'm going to start that from this command line by saying Rails generate controller. And it's typical, not required, but it's typical that we name the controller after the pluralized model. So Rails spends a lot of its conventions around singularized versions of things, usually nouns, and pluralized versions of things. So if we want a controller to access our students, then we just call it students. So we'll say students. And then for our controller, we can either create a blank controller like this, or we can further mention some of the views that we might want, or some of the actions, which each have views, that we might want on this controller. And again, there's conventions around the names, the standard names of the actions. So I'm just going to use 2 of the standard names, and you're just going to trust me for now that these are the standard names. I'm going to create 2 actions, one that's going to display all students, and that's going to be called index. The index action is always the default action of any given controller, and that's similar to, say, in PHP or HTML, when you have like an index.html or index.php. You can leave that part off when you request a path in a PHP application, and it will automatically run that index file. Same thing goes for this index action. It's going to be considered to be the default. It'll be in charge of showing all students. And then a show action is going to be responsible for showing a single student, and the URL associated with the show action will mention by primary key the student we wish to load. So Rails G controller, students, index, show. Yeah.
I input the command of a few keywords too early. Is there any way I can?
Yes, if you need to undo that, you can say Rails destroy controller students, and that will erase that those generated files for you. And then once you run Rails destroy controller students, then you can again run the command of Rails generate controller students index show. And there's a space. It's not easy to see here because it went to the next line, but there's a space between students and index. Okay. Yeah. Oh, let me come see, 1 second. I've added some things, so I'll do a git add. Sometimes when I'm at the command prompt, I'll just use git there. Sometimes if I'm at my editor, then I'll use git there. It doesn't matter from where you use it. So I'll do a git add dot and a git commit new students controller. And here are the files you can see that were added. We've got some JavaScript assets. Rails is a little weird in that it defaults to something called CoffeeScript instead of JavaScript, which is a language that compiles down to JavaScript. There are a lot of these languages these days. They're called transpiled languages. So you write in one thing, and then because the target's always the web browser, in the end they always have to be transpiled down to JavaScript. So the most popular of these right now is TypeScript, which Microsoft is behind, which is JavaScript but with types. It's a really fascinating addition to JavaScript. And then there's also just ways of writing more modernized JavaScript, so writing JavaScript that is supported only by the latest and greatest browsers, and then transpiling that down to older style JavaScript, so writing in ES6 or ES 2015 and transpiling to ES5 so that you have wide support for all of your browsers. That's something that is sort of commonly done in industry using a tool called Babel. So these kind of transpilation steps are done automatically by Rails. Same thing goes for style sheets. Rails doesn't use CSS. No, it needs to add something else here, SCSS. So although when I code JavaScript in Rails, I don't use CoffeeScript. I just like plain old vanilla JavaScript. I do, however, love SCSS. It adds all the things that I always wanted CSS to have, like variables and functions and things like that. So it makes CSS a really, really powerful styling language, more powerful than it is on its own. We'll look into that later on in the course, sort of the ins and outs of SCSS, because it's used widely outside of the Rails community, whereas CoffeeScript is not used widely outside the Rails community, and I have a feeling it'll eventually be removed from Rails. It sort of came about when JavaScript was less powerful, and all of the best ideas of CoffeeScript have been rolled into ES6 anyways. So it had a real influence on the community, and sort of maybe now its time has perhaps come to an end now that those ideas have rolled into JavaScript proper. We have a new controller, and it's in the app controllers folder, and it's called Students Controller, unsurprisingly. We asked for a Students Controller, and that's what we got. There is a file called Students Helper. You can put little helper methods in here. I don't tend to use helpers very often, but when I have, it's when I need something to make a view less complicated. If I'm doing a bunch of logic or creating a very complex component inside of a view, I might encapsulate that logic within a helper. Though they tended to be used more in the early days of Rails, I don't see them used that often anymore. Here's my two views that I asked for. So within the Students Controller, there'll be an index action and a show action. And if we look in the app views students folder, you'll see that there would be two files there, and index.html.erb and show.html.erb. So these are our view template files, and you can see by the addition of the .erb, that's the embedded Ruby syntax, so it's going to be a mixture of embedded Ruby and HTML. And then there's a test file for testing the controller, which we won't get into. Yeah?
I already update the bundler, I installed it, and it's still saying Ruby version.
Oh, let me see. So it's complaining about your Ruby version. When you do a Ruby -v, what are you told?
Ruby -v 2.3.3.
So what you need to do then to make use of my project, because I'm running at a slightly higher version of Ruby, let me just go and open up the folder where I've got this happening. Oh, I put it right off C drive. In the folder, there's two files in the folder. There's a .ruby version and a gem file. You need to open both of those up.
Ruby version and gem file. Okay.
Yeah, so you need to change the version in the Ruby version file to 2.3.3 to match your Ruby version. And at the top of the gem file, you need to do the same. So the reason this is done is because, again, teamwork. If you're working on a team and you want the project you've developed to work the same across all of the developers' machines, you need to make sure that not only are the versions of your gems completely synchronized, but also that the version of Ruby you're using is synchronized across a team. So it's encoded in those two separate files to sort of remind and encourage the team to all use the same Ruby version, but we can override that. What's that?
Is it not better just to update the Ruby version?
And you could also do that. It takes a while, like to update the Ruby version, you have to probably the recommended route is to install a Ruby version manager and then compile Ruby from source and then manage multiple versions of Ruby on your machine. So it's a bit of a pain. If you're using Vagrant, the Ruby version manager is already installed there, and you can go and Google RVM for how to install new versions of Ruby. It's less painful with Ruby version manager. So let's look at some of the files that were created for us, specifically in the app folder. We want to look at, in the controllers folder, this students controller. I'm also going to open up this thing called application controller. We'll just take a peek at it. And in the views folder, there is a students subfolder. I'm going to open that up and open those two files. I keep opening them up accidentally in two different screens. And let's look at these first. So the students controller is a class. It's appropriately named students controller and inherits from something called application controller. Application controller is in that same folder, and it's just an empty class that inherits from action controller base. This empty class is there if you ever need to add things that you want to be inherited by all of your controllers. So it's like a piece of middleware that, you know, the actual behavior that you're inheriting that has to do with controllers comes from action controller base. But if you wanted to add something to all of your controllers, they all inherit from application controller, and you just have this empty class that you can add things to. I don't use this very often, but every once in a while there are things that I like to have global, maybe like little helper methods that have to do with logins and user state. That might be something that I want present across all of my controllers, so I might put that into my application controller. In the students controller, you can see two methods, and so in here I'm just going to make a note. The methods in a controller tend to be called actions. So this is the index action and the show action. They're just methods, but terminology-wise, when you talk to a Rails programmer, you'll always hear them referred to as actions. And when an action is invoked, the associated view for that action is also then executed, and that's what's returned to the end user. And so it auto-magically renders and in our case it'll be the app views, maybe I'll go to a new line here. The app views students index.html.erb, and at the end of running the show action, it'll automatically render the show view. So it's naming convention based. It goes to the views folder, it goes to a subfolder named after the class, and then it renders the view named after the action. And then the final question is, how do these actions actually get invoked? We invoke them from our web browsers by way of the server through URLs. And those URLs are mapped as what are called routes. And so for that, we need to look at the routing file, which is in the config folder. So one of the things that you'll find when you're first coming to a Rails project is that you won't be familiar with all of the standard files and folders, and you'll just find yourself navigating around here and there and having like a lot of different tabs open. That is a common thing. There's like I don't know if it exists for VS Code, but I was using a extension for Atom called Zen tabs, which would like only keep at most 5 tabs open, because I have like a bad case of tabitis. Like if you look at my browsers, you'll see that like they've got a lot of tabs open and then a bunch of browsers to boot. So I also have tabitis in my editors. So Zen tab, you just set like what the limit is, and it just keeps the most, I had set mine to 5, the most 5 recent tabs open. And because these editors have fuzzy finders in them, it's really, really easy to open up files again. So you just hit Control P and you start typing the file's name, and you can just type like chunks of the file. If I wanted to open up application controller, I could type appcon, right? Not like that though. I could type appcon, and then it finds application controller as the first instance, and I just hit enter. So you don't even have to type the whole file or the whole path. You just have to type a portion of it. The fuzzy finder saves you from having to poke around in the workspace view or over here. You'll see me use the workspace view or Windows Explorer because I'm trying not to go too fast. But if you were to watch over my shoulder as I was coding, it would just be me fuzzy finding things whenever I needed them and allowing Zen tabs to close anything other than the last 5 most recently used tabs to manage that for me. Otherwise, I would just end up with a lot of tabs open. Okay, so I got a typo in there. I gotta go now and open up in the config folder the routes.rb file. And when I ran the generator, it added 2 routes for me. So we'll first use those 2 routes and then we'll override them. And so these 2 default routes that have been created that I'm eventually going to delete, but I'll demo them for you. This first one takes an HTTP GET request to /student/index and runs the students controller index action. Maybe I'll put this here. And this one here, similarly, there was a comment in here to begin with. It says, for details on the DSL available within this file, see, and it points you to a Rails guide. So there's a Rails guide on routing you can go to. This is a TLA, a 3-letter acronym. Like our industry is full of them, right? So what does DSL stand for? Has anyone heard that term before? DSL? What's that? Close, but no, it's not that. So that was like a something subscriber line. But this DSL is domain specific language. And so it's something that's used often in the Ruby world, in that some Ruby programmers, before writing a program, will first create a mini language that suits the problem at hand, and then we'll solve the problem using that mini language. So Ruby's flexible enough that we can use it to create mini languages. And so the routing file has its own domain-specific language for setting up routes. And so we'll look at some of that today. Okay, let's actually go and try to use some of these routes. It's at this point, if you're using Vagrant, you will need to restart your server. So one of the things that always requires a restart in Vagrant is modifications to controllers and modifications to routes. And so to restart your server, if you are using Vagrant, all you need to do is hit Control-C at the server, and then up arrow, enter. I'm not using Vagrant, so I didn't need to do that, but it doesn't hurt my server to restart it, but I won't need to restart it when I make those kind of modifications. But just keep in mind that if you are using Vagrant, every time you make a change to the routing file or to a controller, you need to do a quick restart. And you'll just get used to that. The reason why I don't have to do it is that Rails is supposed to, if it's running properly, notice changes to files and automatically reload those files for you.
Never.
So let's try this out. Let's go to /students/index. And we get this, which says students index, find me in app views students index.html.erb, which is sort of where I had mentioned that we would find this thing. So what has happened is the action index is triggered. It contains nothing, so nothing actually executed, but then it went and automatically loaded up this view. And this view we have open here. There is its contents. I can change the H1 here to say something like Hogwarts students. And if I go back and reload this, that's an instance where I don't think you need to restart the server. I believe when working with Vagrant, changes to views don't require a restart. But correct me if I'm wrong there.
No, you're not.
So it worked? Great. And we also have at student/show a show view that's being loaded that says students #show. This is also a bit of Rails terminology. When you see this and a hash mark, it's referring to like this is the controller and this is the action being invoked within that controller with the hash mark in between. So those two auto-generated routes work for us, but that's not really what I want for my routes. So I'm going to change these routes slightly. I'm going to make it so that if we just go to /students, a GET request to /students should route to the students controller's index action. So when I override the default that has slashes in it, where it refers to the controller / the action, and I just change it to just a straight word, I can use the hash rocket to point to which controller and which action I want to execute. That should allow me to go to /students, and again, the Vagrant students will need to do a quick restart. /students now loads that up. That makes me happy. You know, maybe, or at least for now, maybe this is we would like this all students view to be the thing that's displayed for the root of the server. Like maybe we don't want this "yay, you're on Rails" page sticking around. We can have multiple routes that map to the same controller action. And so what I can do is I can also set a root route to students index. Let me test that to make sure it's going to do what I want. There, it overrided that. This points to maybe some inconsistency in how I'm defining my routes. The DSL available within this routing file has changed over time. So although this works, maybe I want some consistency in that I say get student goes to the student controller index action. That won't change its behavior. It's just another way of specifying that thing. And so here I can specify HTTP get to also get rid of this runs. I'm going to leave this one for now, but it will need to be updated. Right now, going to /student/show loads up that show controller action, but eventually what I would like to be able to do is I'd like to make it so that I get request to /student/some numeric identifier, so some number, which we might sort of call an ID with a placeholder. I'd like that to eventually be the route that triggers this show route, but for now we'll just do one thing at a time. We'll only concern ourselves initially with the index. Yeah?
So why don't you switch from using the / to hash mark?
The reason is that they're, just like almost everything else with Rails, there's sort of a convention around if you make a controller that has multiple actions in it, the names and the URLs for those actions. And so in most Rails applications where you don't just have a simple, a single or two actions or something like that, we'll always have the same sort of pattern of URLs and the same pattern of actions, and it doesn't map to the ones that get pre-written for us. So Rails uses something called Restful Routing, where REST is another acronym which stands for representational state transfer. And so we're going to follow the rules of representational state transfer as we build out our routes. So that's it. That's why. So I don't know why Rails doesn't just do that off the hop, but it doesn't. Okay, let's make our controller actually do something, because the goal is that we'd like to at the students controller index action, list all of the students that are in our database. And so in my controller, I could do something like this. I could say at students equals student.all. Active record coming into play right here. Going to the student model, asking for all students, saving it to an instance variable. So not only is the index action going to auto-magically render this view, but it will also give the view access to its instance variables. This is Rails throwing object-oriented convention to the wind, because in a Ruby application, instance variables are private. Rails has monkey patched a bunch of magic into Ruby so that any instance variables we create inside of an action will be automatically shared with the associated view. It's a way of handing data off to the view, and it's one of the many places where Rails sort of purposefully scoffs at the conventions of OO in terms of its own conventions. What that means now is I can go to this index.html.erb and have available to me a students variable, and this is where we're going to see ERB syntax for the first time. So recall that when we were investigating PHP in WebDev 2, this would be an instance, and don't type this with me because this is just me typing PHP code that I'm about to erase. In PHP world, we would do something like a for each, and then we might have like some students variable as student, and then we might then go into HTML mode, and like maybe we'll make a list of students. So I might do a UL, and for each student create an LI, and then inside of there echo out the student's like name or something like that. And then I would end for each, and then I would close my UL. That's the templating style that we were used to in PHP. I think I mentioned this before, is that the original creator of Rails, David Hannemeyer Hansen, had been a PHP programmer and had really liked the immediacy of the PHP language for templating. And so this part of the system is very much like PHP. So instead of this for each here, we're going to do a Ruby loop, and we do it with our ERB tags. And so we're going to say at students.each do student, so a more Ruby-ish loop. And then for our end block, we're going to just need an end, because it's a do end loop. And then for our echo statement, it's going to look very similar, except for that now we are echoing out student.name. So reminiscent of PHP, but slightly different. Percentage signs to delimit our ERB tags, do end blocks, an each instead of a for each, and then a more object-oriented way of accessing properties by doing .name. Again, at this point, if you're in Vagrant, you'll need to restart the server. I'll come back to my code, just let me test to see if it's working. Look at that, lots of students. I think 400 and some odd students that are being listed here. And if we wanted to get like fancy with it, maybe we might say something like student name of house, and then we could refer to that student's house, student.house.name. And let's make this a little bit more readable. So I can break that out over multiple lines because white space has no meaning in the context of HTML. The most white space you can ever inject into an HTML document and have it actually rendered is a single space. And so for readability in my ERB, I might break it up like this. Maybe. I'm working with a fairly low resolution right now, and so it just bothered me that it scrolled off the side of the screen, but you know, maybe if I was on a higher resolution, that wouldn't have bothered me so much. Yours did not work. Did you restart your server?
I did.
Okay, I'll come look at it in a moment. So mine looks like it's working. It's showing me all the different students and their houses. This is what it looks like at a view level. All right, it's been a while since I did anything with Git, and so over here I will review my changes. The changes look like some comments, the actual contents of my index action, the new loop within my view, and the new and improved routes. So I'm going to say that I want to see all of those changes added, and I want a commit message saying implemented the students index action and view. Control enter. And there we are. If we take a moment to go to the Rails overview notes that are on Learn, and you don't need to pull them up, I'm just going to have them up here for a second. You will recall this image that I drew in class a while ago that sort of shows the flow of a Rails request. So we've now gone through this whole thing once. A URL comes into our system. In our case, it is either the slash or the slash students. They will both do the same thing. That URL hits the server, in our case Puma, and is sent to the routing file. The routing file picks up the route, this one or this one, and now it knows which controller action or which controller and action to execute, the student's controller and the index action. And so it travels along and invokes that controller and that specific action. So there it is right there. The controller can now optionally, through the model, communicate with the database. So that's what's happening right here. That data is returned to the controller, and then any instance variables that the controller makes are sent over to the view. So this one right here is sent over to the view. And then within the view, we can use ERB to render out the data. So that's this ERB step here. The one piece of the puzzle that we haven't seen yet is that the view, notice, is not a fully qualified HTML document, right? It's just a piece of an HTML document, and the last square here before the server returns the markup is the layout. So that's the last piece for us to look at here. We can see the layout. I can do a fuzzy find for it, for my application layout right here. It is the document. You'll also find it, if you don't use fuzzy finding, you can find it in the app views layouts folder, application.html.erb. This is the actual HTML document, because if we view source on what was rendered to our browser, we will see that it is a fully qualified HTML document with the view rendered out, but also with like a head, and there's a bunch of assets and scripts and things being loaded in here, name and some meta tags and a doc type. Look, it's got all those things. That's coming from here. If I wanted to, within this body, I could start putting things that would appear on every page. So this yield keyword is where the individual views are yielded into the layout. But I could put, like, for example, a header tag here and a footer tag here, and I could start putting within them little bits of information that perhaps I wanted to have on every page. So I've got a header with an H1 inside of it, a footer with a paragraph inside of it. Now when we go to the index action, it will load up this HTML. Maybe I'll now change this to an H2 and just label this all students. And the layout is going to be responsible for this H1, the view in question, and then a footer down at the bottom. I'll come back to this, just let me execute it over here. There's my H1, there's the H2, and way down at the bottom is my footer. And that will now be present on all views within the system. And the middle part is just the view specific to the action that we just called. So that was done here. The important part being this yield statement. That's where the views get yielded into the layout. So it's here that I might also put a menu Maybe there's a menu that appears within that header on every page, or maybe a sidebar that appears across the pages, or maybe within the footer there's some navigation links. Common stuff goes here. This is also where, as we add styles and JavaScript to our application, they will be automatically added to the HTML by way of these style sheet link tags and JavaScript include tags. And these meta tags are for different types of hacking protection that Rails offers us, and we'll talk about those a little bit later in the course. And so we've now, as I said, gone through this full cycle from browser requesting URL through to the router, the controller action, the model to the database, the controller creating instance variables, the view taking those variables, rendering ERB, injecting that into the layout, and returning it to the end user. A fairly complex chain of actions, but it's always the same. And so if you ever forget the flow of these actions, just pull up the Rails overview notes and stare at this document for a while, and it always flows in this way. So once you understand this flow, you've effectively understood Rails. The only thing that I haven't shown you yet in terms of this interaction is the fact that just like in PHP, where we could pass parameters to the PHP scripts by way of get parameters, we can do the same thing in Rails by way of placeholders in our URL. So we're going to do that right now because we're going to implement a show page. What I would like to do is I'd like to be able to click on any one of these students and go to what will be in the future like a profile page that shows that individual student. And so there should be a link here for each one of these students, and maybe even a link eventually for the houses. And clicking on that will bring me to a show page for that one student. And the URL is going to need to mention by primary key which student needs to be loaded. And it'll look something like this. It'll be like student/some number. So student/56 should load up the student with primary key 56. Student/300 should load up the student that has a primary key of 300. So that's the piece of the routing puzzle that we haven't looked at yet, and we'll do that right now. Before I do that, is there any questions or comments about what we did to implement the index sort of flow, or does anyone need to see any part of my code that I am not currently showing right now? Okay, so let's implement the show. We need to implement it at a few places. We'll need to update the routing to allow for that placeholder. We'll need to update the controller action, the show action, to actually load by way of the model the student that has been requested. And then in the view, we'll display that student, and then the layout will remain the same. Okay, so I can close my index, and I can close this application. The routing file is what I'm going to work with here. Maybe it's time to go over here and just git commit added some common headers and footers to the layout. Okay, so the route that triggers the show action is no longer going to be student/show. That's what's working right now, but there's no way to send which student. What I want it to be is /student/some number, where that is a placeholder for an identifier, an ID. And so in the DSL for routing, I can actually just do that I can just say get, so a get request to /students/ID should route to the students show action. So it's always this first part here is referring to the look of the URL, sometimes with placeholders in place. And when we go to here, it's which controller and which action, separated by a hash mark. Over on the controller side of thing, I need some way to access the ID so I can find the student. Let's assume, just to begin with, that I'm going to just find a student, and I'll specify that student in a hard-coded manner. So I had seen when I was playing around with the system that there was a student called, or with an ID of 317, Dr. Ray Han. And so I could create a student variable where I go to student and I find Dr. 317, which would be that Dr. Ray Hand. This instance variable will now be accessible by way of our show view. So in this case, we, with the index, made a collection available by way of an instance variable of students. Now we make a student object available called @student. There's nothing special to these naming conventions. That's another thing I find that is difficult to pick up when you're learning Rails for the first time. Sometimes the namings of things is super, super important, and if you name them wrong, they won't work. And sometimes the naming of things is just the naming of things. It's just what you as the programmer have named a particular variable. So in this case, there is no conventional reason for why I called this students and student, other than the fact that that's what those variables actually represent. A collection of students and an individual student.
For the controller, you have to rename students.
Yes, the controller itself, and again, it could have been called something else. Like I could have called it Beetlejuice. So there wasn't actually a real convention there, but there is sort of a community convention there. So it's not something that the framework enforces, but the community convention is that you will name the controller after the pluralized model. So this is a controller that's working with the student model, so it's a student's controller. So I could have called it something else and Rails would have been happy to comply, but the community convention is that we name it after the pluralized model. So that's the other difficult thing. It's like which of the conventions are enforced by the framework and which of the conventions are community conventions. Okay, so I'm not yet using the data passed to me by way of the route. I will need to provide, my route now will need to look like some student / some number, but the number will just be thrown away for now. And then over on the show side of things, I have access to that student now, so I can change this H1 to an H2, and I can output the student's name. And a student doesn't have a lot of properties as of yet, but inside of a paragraph tag below, I could say house, and I can output the student.house.name there. And maybe wrapping house in a B. Let me just check to see if this works, and then I'll come back to my code. So I should be able to go to student, it doesn't matter, student anything, and it'll always load student 317 at this point. There it is. So this can be anything, including anything. Right? It's just some student slash something where that something is currently taken to be an ID. And it always loads up the same data. So I'll go back to my code here. Here is that show.html.erb where I'm using an ERB echo statement here and here to output both the student's name and their house name. But it's always the same student. And so I would like to add that final piece of flexibility into the mix, which is that the route is providing to me an ID. In PHP, we would go to the get superglobal. And when we were dealing with posted data, maybe later on, we would go to a post superglobal. In Rails, the post and the get are put together into one hash called params. And so what I can do here is I can find params at position ID. And so the placeholder that I put in my route becomes the key that I key into for the params hash. So if the placeholder had been called :Bob, then I'd be going to params :Bob here. But ID seems to be more suitable in this case. And I will again come back, but let's just go check to see if this works. So we should still see Dr. Ray Han if I go to 317. But if I go to, say, 30, I don't have that student. Oh yeah, because I ran my migrations a few times. So what about 400? Carolyn Lenon. Notice what happens when I go to something that doesn't exist. It's sort of neat. So if when I went to 30, I get this active record not found. We only see this in development mode. If we were running Rails in production mode, this would have thrown a 404 and have displayed the standard Rails 404 page for us, which we can customize. And so in development mode, we get this error message. It shows us the line that threw the exception, the record not found exception, and we're actually dropped down to an ERB prompt where we can actually interact with our database right from the web, which is like a really cool feature, right? So this is the Rails console embedded directly inside of the error message. And it's using JavaScript to build this console, send the data back asynchronously, and the response is back. They're actually executed as Ruby on the server side, and the response is sent back. This is a really amazing way of debugging a Rails application. There may be some tweaking you need to do to get this to properly work if you're using Vagrant. I remember I had to battle with it a little bit. It wasn't a horrible battle, but there was some kind of battle involved. Sorry? This just automatically, for me at least, just opened up when I went to an ID that did not exist. So when I go to some like really large or really small ID, it opens up. And as I said, you might need to, and I can look into what I did last time to get that working under Vagrant, but I can remember it by default not happening under Vagrant. I may have even mentioned that in the Rails overview notes. Let me just take a quick peek here. No, maybe I don't. Oh, maybe I do, though. There's a section on debugging here. Debugging. And there it is. So yeah, there is in the notes, you have to specifically whitelist IP addresses that are allowed to touch the web console. And I can't remember why I used the specific one, 10 022. Seems very specific. There was probably a reason for it, but maybe I saw it in an error message. Maybe that happened to be the internal IP that Vagrant was using. Let me know if this works for you. If it doesn't, we can sort that out. So that's in a config environments development.rb file. Okay, so that's all well and good, but there is also still a problem. I can go to /students/wat. And that's probably not what I want to happen, right? I probably, even though this would just do another record not found, I probably don't even want to route things that aren't numeric. And so I can go to the routing file and I can constrain, let's see if I can remember how to do this off the top of my head. ID and then that. So slashes, or for you, slashes this way, in Ruby are syntactic sugar for defining regular expression objects. So in Ruby we get a regex class, and you can define regular expressions with like regex.new, or you can just within these forward slashes define a regular expression, /d, and I probably need a plus. Is plus one or more in regular expression worlds? So /d means numeric digit, and plus means one or more of the thing that the plus comes after. So I'm saying that the ID is constrained to the regular expression one or more digits, which I think is like a very beautiful and elegant way of working with routing, to be able to constrain aspects of your routes to regular expression matches. I think is a beautiful thing. And so now when I go to, and again, Vagrant users, reboot required or restart required on the server. Now no route matches. This is not a valid route. Whereas a numeric value does match. So we still have the issue of there's like IDs that may not exist in the database, but that we can't prevent, right? You just will have some IDs that don't exist in your database. And so those will still go through. In production mode, they'll trigger 404s, but we can't put, non-numeric things won't come through. I can't remember what it does with things that are sort of partially numeric. So like 300 and then some stuff. Yeah, that won't match the regular expression either. Cool. Yeah. Let's see. So we can switch to production mode over on my server by, let me see if I can remember this. So many things to remember these days. I think it's this, Rails S, and then setting an environment variable called Rails env equals production. We'll know if this works if I see production appear. Whoa, didn't like that at all. But that just might be because there's a bunch of extra steps that are required when we go into production mode that I probably haven't yet addressed. Oh yeah, so there's all sorts of issues now. If I was to try to jump over to production mode, there's a separate production mode database. There's like, so I'd have to run my migrations and there's also like certain secret constants that have to be set up that are used for encryption purposes in production mode. So unfortunately I can't jump right into it. Let me see though, because I have Rails. Yours worked?
Yeah, it's -e in the production.
Oh, so that's it. So it is a memory thing. Dash environment production. It's migrations that need that weird Rails environment thing. This might still die for me because I haven't run the migrations. So like literally there is no database. So that it will probably fail as well. Yeah, this is the dreaded HTTP 500 error. So 500 in all the 5xx HTTP errors means something went wrong on the server side. And when something goes wrong on the server side, nothing gets sent to the client side, right? It's just something horrible happened on the server, can't tell you what it is. So when you see this message with your Rails app in production, you could sort of start crying, I guess. I don't know. It's not the end of the world. You can go to your development log or your production logs, and you can start looking through the log file to see what triggered this error, but you're not given any assistance from the front end of things. That said, I do have Rails applications running in production that I can test this very thing on right now. One of them is the notes. So all of our course notes are a Rails app. It's a Rails 2.3 app though, so it's really old. But let's so we were gonna try to look at the two different error messages. So if I put something that's not a number, yeah, this is like the absolute default Rails 404 page. It's not the nicest looking thing, but it's the page you were looking for. It doesn't exist. It fires off a 404. Same thing if I go to get like a numeric value that doesn't exist. And so that's what gets triggered there. Okay, that means it's time to do a little bit of source control. So we've added the ID to the student class. We updated the student show, and we added the ID to the routing file. Okay, so I'll just say the show action and route now involve a primary key ID. Show view now shows the student. One other thing I will show you is that I alluded earlier to the fact that Rails makes use of, as sort of a global default for how routing works, it makes use of something called Restful Routes. And so I can actually remove all of this routing that I added to this file. I'll leave my root route in because that one's sort of special. That's something I want extra. I always want the root to go to the index action. But I can just say resources, students, only, index, and show. And oops, let me just make sure that that still works, and then I'll come back. Thank you. Perfect. So that's still working. Slash students is still working. Slash is still working. And slash students slash non-numeric. Not as nice because that still got routed. I could mess with this to add those extra constraints in. I won't do that right now. All of that's in the routing guide. But this is typically, as Rails programmers, how we create our routes is we just declaratively ask for them out of the resource command. So we mention the controller by name and then which of the 7 RESTful routes that we want. And so the 7 RESTful routes that Rails makes accessible to us are index, show, new, create, edit, update, and I can't remember if it's delete or destroy. I think delete. It's one or the other. I can't remember. We could look it up. It might be destroy. That'll be in the routing file, or in the routing guide. it is destroy. And those all sort of, I'll show you what each of their URL patterns look like. Once you know what these URL patterns look like, you can actually start to spot Rails applications online because you will notice them by their URLs. They will always have the same pattern of how the URL works. So using students as an example, a GET request to /students will load up the index action. A GET request to /students/SomeID goes to the show action. A GET request to /students/new loads up a form into which you can put information for a new student. So that's part one of create. This form posts to a separate action, the create action. So Rails takes those two pieces and takes them apart for us. So you have one action for displaying the create form, and then one action for actually invoking the create itself. So a post to /students will create the student. Notice an interesting thing here. This was the very first time I had seen this as a web developer. We have two URLs that are the same. /student, when sent a GET request, does one thing, and /students, when sent a POST request, does another thing. So that's a neat feature of Rails, and it's just following, again, what's called Restful Routing, where REST stands for Representational State Transfer, which is a style of treating HTTP as a collection of resources that can be treated with these 7 things. The edit action is triggered by a GET request to /students/ID/edit. That will load up a form that will be pre-populated with the student of that ID's data. And when you submit that form, it'll go to the update action, and it'll use I think a patch. So that's a HTTP verb that you have not used before, right? In WebDev 2, we only used the 2 actions, get and post. HTTP has more actions. There's a put, there's a patch, and there's a delete. It's just that browsers don't necessarily support those. Rails hacks them into the browsers by way of JavaScript. And so when you send a patch, or historically it used to be a put, but they changed that to /student/ID, maybe it is still a put. I can't remember what they did for that. It might actually support both. That will go there. What I'll do is I'll put this on 2 lines, because I think update currently still supports both. And then a destroy is a delete to that particular resource. So what you'll notice here is that there are 2 flavors of routes that Restful Routing makes use of: collection routes and member routes. Member routes are the routes that have identifiers, so they are routes that are pointing to a member of a collection or a member of a resource. So in our case, our resource is students, and we want to show an individual student or edit an individual student or update or delete an individual student. We mention it by ID. And then we also have collection routes that have to do with the collection as a whole. So listing all students is a collection route, creating new students is a collection route, and responding to posts from the new form to actually persist new students is a collection route as well. So this is an acronym you'll hear a lot of in industry. It's starting to fall out of favor in the API world, but for a while it was like if you were wanting to work in the world of the web and you specifically wanted to be designing APIs, your goal would be to be creating RESTful APIs. And so you'll still see companies, when they announce that they have an API online, they'll say this is a RESTful API, meaning it conforms to these various 7 actions. Rails purists that conform to RESTful routing will say that a controller can only include these actions, that your controller can include 1 to 7 actions, and they must be from this list of RESTful routes. And if you get yourself into a place where you're trying to add something that goes beyond this to a controller, it's a sign that you need a whole other controller. And that other controller can then be well named, and you can then, access that resource with one of the 7 RESTful routes. I'm not that much of a Rails purist, so you'll see me in this course sometimes adding non-RESTful things to Rails controllers, but there's a great conference talk that I can point you to that sort of goes over the benefits of being sort of a RESTful purist in terms of always, creating new controllers when you feel like you need to go outside of the 7 RESTful routes. That's a lot to take in. I want to drop one more bit of knowledge on you before I go, which is when I first mentioned the show page for the students, I mentioned that I would like it to have links on, so going to /students would give me a link to each one of those show pages. Because right now I still have to manually put in a number up here. You're never going to ask your users to manually manipulate, hopefully, URLs to interact with your application. You're going to want them to be clicking around, and you're going to want the URLs to be automatically generated for you, right? You don't want to have to manually write all these URLs. Let's open up the index again, the index view. So that's over in my app views students folder. Right here where I'm displaying the name of the student, and this is another argument for always using Rails RESTful routing. The RESTful routing is yet another convention, and when you work with Rails conventions, it allows you to do things easier elsewhere. So because we're using RESTful conventions, I can simply change this to be a link to statement, where the first argument of link to is what's going to be displayed for the link, and the second argument is what I want to link to, which is just the student object. And link to knows that RESTful routes for show actions include IDs, and it can see that this object that I have provided it has an ID, and so it can create for me it's like it reverse engineers the route that you requested here, and it actually builds that route into the href attribute of the link it makes. So as we're looping, if we hit like student with an ID of 300, this is going to create for us an A tag with an href that's going to /students/300 with the body of that tag being the student's name. And here, it's common in the Rails world to leave out parentheses. So this is really like a method call to link to with 2 arguments, but most Rails programmers will not put those in. They'll just have it be linked to name and student. So if I go over here, those are all now links. I should be able to click on any one of those links and go to that person's page. And that, you can see, has their ID in it. If I view source, we can see all of the links that were created. They're created in terms of a relative path. That doesn't include the domain name, which is great because right now we're up on localhost, but when we push to production, we'll be on a different domain and we might change subdomains or whatever. I'm a big fan of not ever including the domain in my hrefs to allow for that kind of portability of domain and subdomain. So it's just a relative path to /student/the ID. And if you need to add things to the link, like you wanted to add a class to that link, I believe I just need to do this. So if I wanted a class of student on the link, let me see if this actually does what I want it to do. Over in View Source World. There it is. So now all of those links have a class of student, or I could give them a class of anything I wanted, and then I could, from my style sheets, refer to those classes and style them as I wanted to. So that I'll just leave out, but that's just showing some of the extra things you can do with link to. So for more information on how to work with link to, of course, you can go to the Rails API. And it has an autocomplete finder that you can use. So I can just say link to. And you can see what is available. So it takes a name, some options, and some HTML options. And it gives you a bunch of examples of how to work with that. The second argument here isn't always an active record object. It could just straight up be itself a URL. And so if I wanted to be slightly more manual about how I created this, I could make this a string and I could concatenate onto the string /students, the ID of the student, but all that work's done for me. But link to can be created to just straight up, I'll even show you. If I go to back over to the layouts, to the application layout, let's say I wanted this H1 to always point back home. Well, then I might go here and make it echo out link to, with Hogwarts School being the link body and slash being that. Go back over here to make sure that that worked. Click that at any times, it takes me back home. So this can just be, and I could also point this to, somewhere else. Right? It could just be a full URL and it would build the URL for me. And then Rails also allows it to be dynamic in that in our routing file, we created a route, so I can just ask for the route path by name, and it'll route to slash for me in that manner as well. So that will do the same thing as hard coding in slash. So that was here within the application layout. Okay, I think that's more than enough for today. Let's quickly review the things that we did today. We set up some routes first manually by way of using the little DSL made available to us where we say get some path, and then we tell it where we want to go to, where we mention a controller, and an action by name. I'll leave this in here. Standard DSL. We saw that we could put placeholders into those paths as well and have them available to us by way of the params hash inside of the index land. After building out in a manual way the index and the show routes, we then switched over to just requesting index and show out of the 7 possible restful routes. So we requested this one and this one. And because we mentioned students by name, it's going to go to the student's controller automatically. So we set up 2 routes here along with a route route. Later on in our application, we might decide that we don't want the route route to be the student index action. We could change it to something else later on, some other kind of home page. But for now, there's 2 different things that route to the student index action, the route and this index. And then we built out the index and the show actions in the controller that we generated, where they were first empty. We had the index action fetch all students and put it into an instance variable. We had the show action fetch a student by ID, where that ID came to us by way of that placeholder in the routing file, where we either manually defined it or used our restful routes. It's the same. And then in both cases, after the action runs, the associated view gets automatically loaded. The view is loaded by convention, going to the app views folder, going to a subfolder named after the controller, so students, and then an HTML ERB file named after the action. There are some actions we're going to see later on that don't have views associated with them, that sort of short circuit that. So delete, for example. When you delete a resource member, you just end up redirecting back to the index because there's nothing really to show. I mean, you could show a page that said deleted, but there's other ways of displaying a success message after something's been performed in Rails. So with the delete, for example, you would just delete that student and then redirect back to index. So there's no view associated with delete. Same thing goes for update. Once a student has been updated, we'll just redirect to the show page of the student. And same for create. When a student has been created, we'll redirect to the show.
You can change the default redirections in the controller.
Can you change the default, what?
Redirections.
Yes, you most definitely can. So there's a redirect to command that can be used in the controller, and you can redirect wherever you want. There's also a render command that allows you to render other actions views. So we can reuse views in that manner, which is sometimes helpful. We do that on create and update. If everything is successful when we create an update, we want to redirect to the show action. If there's validation errors, we want to display those. So we borrow the edit or new form and display that. So we can override both redirecting, but also override what view gets rendered. And then the last thing we did is we actually built out our 2 views. The index one took the collection that it received from the controller, looped over the students, used ERB echoes to echo out some information, and the last thing we added there was a link to the show for that particular student. And in the show page, we just displayed the student by name using the ERB echoes and their house. And that's it. That was our journey twice through the sort of request process render loop that Rails has to offer. And we'll continue on by implementing, I probably won't go through all of the restful routes, but I will at least do the create and add the new and create pair to show how to actually get some data into the database. And the others will be up to you if you need them to research and implement. And so there you go. That's the end of today's lecture. Hopefully the sound recorded today.